Are you new to Star Wars Unlimited and looking to see what all the good decks are? Or maybe with the new PQs just dropping, you just signed up for a PQ and you're looking to start prepping. What's up, guys? KTOD Matty here, hitting you with my take on the definitive Twilight of Republic meta Star Wars Unlimited Gauntlet. Say that 10 times fast. A lot of people have asked us about gauntlets. Pups in here. A lot of people have asked us about gauntlets. I know it's a popular concept from other games, so I wanted to kind of use the concept of a gauntlet to kind of talk about where the meta is at right now and give you some resources to prepare. When preparing for, the meta, you want to be able to kind of build in lines in tech for certain things. So this is a good opportunity to take a look at the major players as well as kind of the concept of the Star Wars Unlimited meta as a whole. One thing I'm going to go over is the 5 pillars of the meta, a concept that Mike brought to the game early on after a Connecticut 1K. Not only is it aggro mid-range control, but really sliding in these 2 extra concept of soft control and aggro tempo. And aggro tempo is very popular in this game. Based off the way it is designed, I think aggro tempo is likely one of the stronger, if not the strongest thing you can be doing, especially with Jango popping off. And so we're going to look at that, and I'll give you my thoughts and also some tips on navigating a gauntlet. So without further ado, let's get cracking. All right, so here it is. Here is the 5 pillars of the meta I talked about, and we're just going to jump right into it. Number 1, I bet you won't be surprised. We'll go from left to right. I bet you won't be surprised to see that the number 1 and only deck under the aggro section I have is Sabine. Sabine is a premier aggro strategy that I think will be in the meta as long as she is in premier, whatever they intend to do with the rotation and things like that. And so it's a deck you always have to prepare for. When we talk about prepping your deck list, I think the first 2 decks you go to are probably in the aggro and aggro tempo strategy, then all the way to the right to the control, and then coming back into some of the middle stuff. So starting with Sabine is one of your first stress tests, and I've decided to use Al's list from the recent PQ, 200-person PQ overseas. Al navigated that meta very well. And so when people are looking to build decks, this is going to be the first place they look. So if that's the first place they look, that is the first thing you want to prepare for. Obviously, he has some tech of his own with the Yularen. And so when you're getting playtesting games against this deck, I would say that is one of the cards you're probably going to want to cycle in and out, as well as the Spec Force Soldier. So using this list as a guideline, understanding everyone has their own tech. And so when you test, you want to look at those bubble cards, and those are the first ones that I'm going to steer you towards. Other than that, I think this is a great place to start. We've covered a lot of this in our meta report, so I'm not going to beat down the door talking about Sabine for a long time. I just want to key you in on the fact that this is a premier strategy. You need to know the lines against a deck like this, and because he has some tech, switching in and out to know different lines. Like, for instance, this weekend, I played Tarkin Town, Quinlan Vos, and I knew that a common theme that they did was they would ECL in K2 to kill my Ezra. And there I would want a 4-drop pretty consistently to be able to play it and ping and take out the K2. So, that's when you bump up the number of 4-drops in your deck. So that's just an example of how that you would go ahead and we're going to break up the camera angles a little bit so you don't just have to stare at that for the whole time. So that would be an example of a time where you take a list like this, you see how they clash into each other, and you build lines in your deck. So that is an example from the Tarkin Town deck. Another one that we found, again, going to the 4-drop slot, is Kira Unit. Kira Unit did a really good job at coming down on 4 and naming something like Poe Dameron or your Wreckers. And so even if it wasn't in their hand, you named that card, and so they would not have that play available to them to the next turn. A lot of time they were banking on that. So again, this is just in the context of my Quinlan deck, but that's how I navigated the gauntlet. I said, okay, what are the things that they could be doing, and how am I going to fight that? So that was Sabine, and I ended up playing Sabine round 7 and also the first round of the top cut. So that, testing and looking at these deck lists and what they're trying to accomplish really came in handy there as I won both those matches. All right, and so again, I only had one aggro deck, and aggro tempo, I've talked about this. The first deck I'm going to talk about is Yellow Han. The reason I chose Yellow Han there was I think it's one of the premier strategies now that Boba is gone to navigate the metagame. It once you know the lines, I feel like it handles aggro well, so it handles the thing to the left, and it has a really good game into some of the control decks. So it really just needs to figure out the things in the mid-range. There's some random mid-range matches that can be a little scary. So if I was to focus on Yellow Han, I would get familiar with my Sabine matchup and my Jango matchup. Spoiler, Jango will be in here. I would learn the lines against control, and then I'd probably take the most of my time just figuring out what mid-range strategies are kind of hard for me to deal with. So I am looking at, this should be Phil, aka the number guy, his SCG Con Columbus deck list. I think this is a good place to start. It is, other than the event in Birmingham, this is another premier event that is going to really influence the meta. So that's where I would be looking. And from here, I don't think there's like too many cards that you need to worry about cycling in and out. I think that this deck is in a good spot in terms of what you should hope to face. Obviously, certain people might, who knows, they might have a Gammo or some other card main deck that we're not seeing here. However, I think that when looking at this deck, this is a good place to be ready for. With the, people have Jango in their eye, so obviously he has the Azatuk to combat that, but this looks pretty standard fare. The only thing I would say is when you're playing these best of threes, maybe try to build a bigger sideboard and see what kind of cards they could bring in against you. It never hurts to kind of figure out what tech would hurt your deck and play games where they've really teched out for you. So that's what I would say when looking at this deck. That is a pretty good plan to have. And I know there's multiple versions. I mean, if you have all the time in the world, maybe you look into more of a rebel-focused version. However, I think, one of the things that we find, right, is we need to be efficient with our time. I think the average card game player for Star Wars Unlimited is not that young, so I'm sure we're balancing a lot of life and, job responsibility. So I think here I wouldn't get too in the weeds. Know your lines, know some of the things that they can do. I think that, and what I'll say about this Han deck too, I think it's one of those decks that has kind of these champions of the deck. And so if someone in your meta isn't one of those Han champions, I don't think it's going to be so popular that you need to, worry about it. So if you don't have, an Alex Blandon or a Phil, or, I know Ian's been playing the Anakin, but you never know, he could swap back, right? So if you don't, and I'm sure there's a bunch of other great Yellow Han players. So if your local has a Yellow Han player, I would, I'd obviously know the lines. Being efficient, if you don't have a lot of Yellow Han players in your local area, I would say push this one down on the playtesting prep for you, because it is a difficult deck to play. There are a lot of nuances to it, so people aren't picking it up just yet all the time. And so, when looking at this gauntlet, we're going to kind of look at which ones you should kind of always vet against and which ones can be a little more, have an idea, but you don't need to get in the weeds on it. All right. The next one is Jango. Surprise, surprise. Now, an ancillary point, I'll just say real quick, to the Han thing, this is a deck you're going to want to play against and know the lines and test and check every deck that you build or want to play against. Both Sabine and Jango are like your stress testers. And so when looking at a deck list, I went with this, I think a top four deck list from Birmingham. I think it's in a really good spot. You know, we talked on the pod about some card differences. So when you're playing this deck, look at some other list and see, you know, what they're doing instead of the main deck Tri-Fighter. However, and that's just the same point to the you know, to the alarm point in the beginning. Like, there's going to be little things you want to test in and out within a 60. But I think this is in a great spot. I think that Jango is just an unbelievable aggro tempo strategy. It's really potent. One card I would add to my sideboard to be prepared for is Bazine. And even if not all the decks are playing them, I think that's one of those cards you need to be ready for them to disrupt your game plan. So this is a deck to get in the weeds about, and building a bigger sideboard and finding ways that they can kind of disrupt you a little bit out of the board is a wise choice, because I can't imagine we don't. There's so many negatives there. We live in a world where Jango is likely the best deck, if not a top 2 deck. So when I'm really getting ready for it, I'm going to put a lot of time there. And then if I'm a Jango player, you know, navigating that meta and like figuring out ways that they're going to come at me. And so maybe like, again, like maybe Bazine ends up in your deck because you're finding that it can really be a blowout on either the 4 resource turn or something for 2. That's pretty cheap and effective there. All right, so the next deck I have is Quinlan. I'm going to zoom out for a second on this. So mid-range is a really tough, you know, area to go through. And so you can't be prepared for everything. So what my goal here is to kind of just represent a few different things. And so Quinlan, I'm going to look at the green version. I think the Tarkentown version is good, but I just don't think it's as popular. So if you have a lot of time and it's not in this slide, go check out, you know, our pod. I have my Quinlan deck list there for the red version, but I think the green is one that I'm seeing catch a lot more eyes. At least in our Discord, it seems to have a little bit more of a vibrant community around it, and I obviously played it in the top. I mean the 1K I went to. So Quinlan for me, I would know both colors, but if I had to pick one, again, we're being efficient, I would pick the green one to be prepared for. And the reason I'd pick the green one to be prepared for is really like the General's Blade home 1 combo is just so disgusting. Or even just getting out like earlier Emphasis or a cheaper Han Solo so you can do multiple things at once. And so I chose this 6-2 list. I mean, 6-2 in an 8-round event is incredible. So yeah, it didn't top 8, but this is where I would go. This is where I think a lot of people would go when kind of scouring the event results. I think this is the first Quinlan green deck to really shell up. I mean, at least in a 200-person tournament, this is kind of would be the definitive starting place if you are somebody scouring the deck list results and not necessarily in our Discord talking to, you know, the thread there. So and again, we're going to talk about cards that I would be wary of. I think True Strike is a great card. I just think that not everyone's playing that one. So that would be one, again, where you're in and out on it. Another card I'd probably be in and out on is Sabine Unit and ECL. So, you know what I mean? Like, I think that we don't want to get too in the weeds on all the different deck types, but because the color palette is the same, I would get games, a couple games against, you know, Tapioca City and a couple games against ECL, expanding the sideboard. But the thing I really like about Quinlan Vos, especially the green version, is it can kind of beat up on a lot of the other mid-range decks. You know, it gets the ramp in some of these cheaty effects. I love the commission. I know our teammate Chrono's been really high on commission. I know Mike's been high on commission since set 2. So I love that that's in this list. So I would prepare for Quinlan decks playing commission to grab the Blade and to grab some of the transports, right? You can get the Falcon, you can get the Bright Hope. So I think that is a card as an ancillary to what is kind of random. I would be prepared for people to play that. I know that I'm trying to find room in my own list to add it because I wasn't on it. There's just so many good things in this color palette that it can be hard to find a 60. But other than that, I mean, I think that this looks great as a starting point. And I like the reason why I'm picking this over Tarkentown version 2 as well is like a suited up Quinlan Vos is really scary with the General's Blade. So like one thing I talk about when preparing, I'll zoom out to my, we'll take a break from this list for a sec. One thing, you can look at the mustache. One thing that I talk about a lot in terms of like, building decks or, preparing is you got to prepare for the opponent's leader. And so, back in set 1, we were dealing with Churits with lightsabers and things like that. And so this is a deck that is really, with the commission, is really trying hard to put a blade on Quinlan Vos. It's like their unfair thing that they do. So having a deck in your gauntlet that does that thing, we're talking about preparing for lines. Having a deck that always or almost always suits up their leader is a good way to test your deck, because you're going to need certain cards to deal with that, whether it's a Rival's Fall or a Bamboozle or something like that. And so we're not only looking at deck lists, but we're looking at lines that you're going to face, right? We're going to look at, Overwhelm ECL lines and how to mitigate those that we talked about earlier, or some of the powerful starts that Jango can have with the tempo. Do we need to be playing more shieldy guys? You see Crafty Smugglers in this list, right? And L337's another list. And in here, I would say the main talking point is suiting up a leader and trying to cheat it out. So how do we fight that would be the question. I play a lot of golf and disc golf and holes. When you play a hole, it's like, what question is this asking me? So we can kind of do the same thing. It's like, what question is answering this deck list asking me? And it's like, can you deal with a cheated out leader? Are you a little more robust and you can deal with some of the disruption effects of like Kira and so my Quinlan decks kind of lean more into that. Like, there's only one Kira in the 60 here. When I test against this, I would probably bump it up to 3 in the 60 and practice against when they play 3 main deck Kiras or 3 post-boarded Kiras or whatever. That would be where I would look to when prepping. All right, and so the next mid-range deck, and this is not. So the next point is there's going to be 2 red-blue hero decks, and basically what I would advise you to do is pick against them. Personally, as much as I think Anakin is like a cool deck, I think Rey, and so just to give you a spoiler, Anakin is here. Although, why did I do that? Because I don't exactly know how to go back on my slideshow, so we'll just come back a little bit. Where were we? Okay. So anyway. So the next 2 decks I would say pick between, kind of like the 2 Quinlans, but they're 2 separate decks. And so I think Rey is in a really good spot. I think Tarkintown is kind of busted right now. And one thing she does really well is like make the little dinkers live. Like, one play that Jango does is ping your guy Tarkintown it. If they play R2, it gets pinged, then you pump the R2. Tarkintown no longer kills it, so it's got some insulation there, kind of like Shieldy Boys do. And so I went with Sean's list from the Columbus 2K. I mean, there's not so much to say here. Like, it's a quality list. It covers all the bases. Obviously, there's situational cards like the Senatorial Corvette. One thing I'd look to is like whether pillage is in the main or side. That would have been more of a consideration if Pierre did not just win that big event, and we'll talk about obviously that deck later in the control section. Spoiler alert. But this deck, I think, is really well aligned. It has stabilization to with restore to get back in the game. This version is really leaning in towards Jango with the 3 patrol crafts. And I think that's the way that this deck wants to operate right now, with given how good Jango is. So I don't think I'd exactly change much here. Perilous Position, I think a lot of blue decks, and the Bossk deck is playing it too, is going to be a card that you need to be prepared for. So, when looking at what lines are we trying to look out for here, we're looking out for force throw decks. And so that's another reason why I put this in over, say, Quinlan Tarkintown, is this will get you your force throw reps. And so that's like an important thing, right? It's like, where am I getting my reps? So this deck is giving me my force throw reps. It's giving me, again, another look at suited up, leaders. And then from there, it's also like what color schemes, like what cards am I, other cards am I getting reps on? And this would be your blue hero, your Lukes, and your Obies. So I think this puts you in a good spot of like a representation of the meta. So like if you face, you know, a blue-green deck, you kind of know some of the reps against the blue stuff, or vice versa. Or, you know, you kind of understand how people are trying to navigate their force throws when you play the Quinlan Tarkentown, because you've kind of gotten your reps here. So I think that's like a way to do it that's really smart. And then again, build out any sideboard you see. I really like the Force Surrender. So if I'm playing control, like I want them to bring in all the hate and see how I can navigate that. I think this is a good spot. All right, so Anakin, we'll touch on Anakin briefly. I went with Ian's deck from the 2K because I think that this is the best performing Anakin deck we've seen so far. I think it had a little bit of trouble at Birmingham. I could be wrong, which makes sense given the rise of some of the Palps and some of the Bosks, right? And so, you know, if I was to pick between the two decks, I'd pick Rey. It does a lot of the same things. Although, say I was more of like an aggro deck, like maybe you play both and you worry less about some of the control reps, because this deck on the play can really present some tough problems. You know, they play Green Squadron, you play Green Squadron, they get to, you know, outtrade, stuff like that. So we've talked a lot. I've talked about this list a bit in other videos, so I'm not going to go in the weeds, but this is another option. If you have, you know, the Annie players local and not the Rey players, yeah, just pick this deck. But this is two versions in the mid-range category that I think can give you a good spot. Okay. Next up for soft control is Kira. Now I'm going to give a disclaimer. Kira, again, is one of those, you know, there's the players that play it and there's kind of everyone else. I think Kira is in a decent spot here. So I would say looking into Kira is a good idea because it gives you the Vader reps and some of the Barrage reps. However, I think you could also look to Krennic, and I think a lot of people like Krennic right now. So I'm going to highlight Kira. You could easily turn this into Krennic or Blue Palp, although I know we saw it do well, and in your area it might be the move. But I already have another spoiler, I'm going to have a yellow Palp. So this could easily be a Palp. I was giving two options there instead of just, you know, two versions of Palp to kind of widen our spread. But yeah, I think Kira's still good, and I'm going to look at Derek's 30-point version. I'm partial to the ECL version. However, we haven't seen ECL pop off yet. So again, just like that Quinlan 30 deck, I would try to get reps into both. And those are really, you know, those are some small switches. You just add in more Long Pikes and probably Gideons and take out, you know, some of the more expensive stuff. And I would say this deck probably needs to be main decking one Relentless now because the Bosky boy just took down a big event. But other than that, I think this is a great place to start. It plays all the good blue-green stuff. It did well. It gets you reps, like I said, into Barrage, into Devastating Gunship, again into Perilous. You're getting used to your Vaders, your Edict effects, and stuff like that. So this would be where I start. I think that, you know, Traders is an interesting one. I think we might see some artifact. Oh my goodness, I called it artifacts. Jeez Louise. Some upgrade hate with Bossk coming out. So maybe, you know, looking when you're testing against this other stuff they could be doing again instead of Traders, but also getting the reps into like hating on stuff like Traders as well, making sure your deck packs that appropriate punch there. But other than that, I mean, I think this is a good starting point, and then I would just swap in between this and the ECL version. All right, and now Palp. We just saw two Palp decks do very well in Birmingham, and so I'm going to highlight the yellow one for the reasons I stated earlier. Plus, like, I know Mike is pretty high on yellow Palp, and he was sending some encouraging messages about it last night through some playtesting, so we might see this on the rise. So that's why I chose this version. And obviously, we went with Josh's version. I think it's like roughly 2 million cards. So maybe when you build your Gauntlet version, trying to skim down to 50 main, you know, in the 10 sideboard. Well, luckily he still has that limitation, so it couldn't get too crazy, right, Josh? But no, this is a great list, and it does a lot of interesting things. I think there's a world where you play the Underworld McClunky stuff, which I think is really cool. And so if you have Palp players locally and you want to get into the nuanced reps, that's somewhere where I would lean. But if I'm getting Palp reps, this is good because it gives you the green yellow reps as well. Stuff like Cad Bane out of the sideboard and Bossk paired with, the ramp and stuff like that. This will give in the Vaders. This will cover that in case you face like yellow Cad or yellow Jango. You'll at least have reps into some of the same cards. The overwhelming barrage in the yellow green version. I don't have the most experience ever with this deck, so in terms of giving advice on where to kind of change things other than the McClunky package, I'm not 100% sure. But what I do really like is the attrition package in the sideboard with Palp's Return and Bounty Hunter Crew, and I think Unmasking the Conspiracy is very good in this deck, obviously, because you draw a lot of cards, you can easily pitch one. And we found targeted disruption like Spark, like Kira, and now like this, Unmasking the Conspiracy, are great. So this is a fun one, and I think one that I'm really excited to see kind of break into the meta. So that's why I highlighted this for you to prep, because I think other people are going to get drawn to this as well. And that's one of the things to talk about too, is like, this is a game in the Star Wars game. So one thing to be considering is like, people want to have fun when they play. I know that seems counter to competitive, but it really isn't. Deck selection is such an important thing, and kind of getting into the minds of other players to see what decks will be on the rise can be important as well. We saw that Anakin deck, and it poses the question, is it better than Rey? I don't know. It does some cool things, and it's an exciting leader that has like a big pop. And so when I look to decks, I'm like, what percentage of people are going to come in there because they just like it or think it's interesting? And that, that could just be 2%, but that could, tip the scale in terms of facing it or not. And then finally, and we've built a little pyramid here, which I think is nice. I do think a lot of the decks are going to kind of fall into this more than these. And in terms of reps, every deck has different things they want to highlight. But I think the meat and potatoes kind of being here. Although, like, personally, I'd be prepping more for Bossk than Kira. And I'd pick, one of these and one of the two versions I've kind of mentioned. But yeah, Bossk is now on the map. It's, shout out to Pierre, crushed that big event. And so I think when you have a deck that wins a big event, everyone's going to want to play it, right? Or prepare for it or whatever. So you kind of need to be prepared. People are going to be on this deck. Or if you are one of the people that's going to be on it, probably get used to a mirror match, and also learn, just even getting the reps and learning how people fight it, can be very helpful. So other than what we've talked about, I mean, I would say with this deck, I've seen people run into like, running more units a little bit, running things like Death Trooper to pair with the ping and then have like a body hanging out. That can be an interesting way if you're trying to like see the different nuances within this deck. But other than, like tweaking some numbers, I think that you just run this out right as it is, and use this as your guidepost. One thing to be aware of when testing this, if you're on the right side of that meta pillar, is being aware of the time rules. So in our recent video, Mike did an intro on knowing the rules and really getting in there. If you are piloting this deck or something that has a long matchup against this deck, I would practice some timed matches, and I would practice, navigating those rules. Obviously, that is not something that's going to come up all the time, and I wouldn't steer my gameplay towards, time, especially because, there's the Swiss and the top cut. But understanding that when you're playtesting against this deck with anything other than, like I almost called it Sabine or Jango. Time the control matches. That would be my advice there, is really be aware of time, because it is a resource. It is something that, changes the complexity of the game and the complexion of the matchup, really, because if you win the first game, there's pressure on your opponent to, close things out. Or if you are losing game one and you need to get into get winning 3, you have to learn when you're going to concede. So knowing the matchup, playing for time, and knowing, you know, how to navigate those extra rules on top of just how the cards interact is super important. So I wouldn't change much, I think. And that really rounds it out. Here is my take on the Star Wars Unlimited Gauntlet. I think this is a great representation. Obviously, there's little nuances, right? There's Kira versus Krennic. There's Rey versus Annie, even though I have them both. Maybe it's a yellow Annie to get your red-yellow reps in, or maybe it's a red Quinlan. But I think if you look at this gauntlet and kind of make it work for you in terms of what am I expecting or have I seen locally? Do I have one of those yellow Han guys? Do I have something kind of off the radar that Matty didn't talk about but I know is popular? You know, maybe there's turret players in your area. Slot one of those in and just using the ideas of where the flex cards come into play, getting reps into certain lines, even within a certain deck, you know, getting reps into leaders that pump up or decks that play force throw or barrage or anything like that. So I think this is a great place to start. If you're just getting into the game, those are 9 great successful players in their deck lists. The links will be in the description that you can go and just jump right into the game, you know, build them for your friends to kind of try out what SWU's about. Or if you are a grinder that I always mention, you know, I think that's a great place to start. And just the way to navigate a gauntlet is to just be efficient and understand that, you know, you shouldn't play a million games against all these, but you know, these are the ones to keep in mind. So when constructing a new deck or updating your deck, having these cards, these lines, these major players in mind. So that's it for me. Hit me in the comments. Let me know what you would add to your list, or any general feedback is always appreciated. Like I mentioned a lot, you know, a gauntlet discussion is just a way to talk about the meta, the decks, how I would prepare. There is no right or wrong answer in a lot of these cases, other than probably making sure you have Sabine, Jango, and Bossk in consideration. I think those probably are not moving. And it's just a fun way to talk about Star Wars Unlimited and help you guys out. If you want more from us, we have the main page. We have our Patreon, all those good things that I'm sure you've heard about a million times. If you're on my side channel, it means you're probably pretty into the KTOD experience. So I hope you're enjoying it. And yeah, happy Thanksgiving, y'all.